The airstrike that shook Russia's heavy industry. Ukraine strikes at the heart of steel production. How did the attack unfold, and why is it seen as a turning point? The governor of the Lipetsk region, Igor Artamonov, publicly acknowledged the occurrence of a massive drone raid, stating that fragments of downed drones had fallen on houses and a water treatment plant. Nevertheless, Russian authorities downplayed the severity of the incident. In contrast, eyewitnesses described intense scenes, with drones streaking across the sky and air defense systems engaging in response. According to independent sources, the real target was the Novolipetsk steel plant, a key element in supporting the Kremlin's military infrastructure. Moreover, the attack triggered large-scale power outages in the region, indicating the extent of the damage. Artamonov mentioned that emergency crews were working to restore the electricity supply. What drones might Ukraine have used? Although Ukrainian authorities have not issued an official statement, experts speculate that long-range drones were deployed. One possibility is the UJ-22 airborne model, capable of carrying up to 20 kilograms of explosives and covering a distance of 800 kilometers, enough to reach Lipetsk. However, its size makes it more vulnerable to interception. A more plausible option is the UJ-26 Beaver drone, with a low aerodynamic profile and a range of approximately 1,000 kilometers. This model has already been used in other attacks on Moscow and other strategic locations in Russia. It is also possible that Ukraine used the A-22 Foxbat, a drone similar to a militarized light aircraft, successfully tested on missions exceeding 200 kilometers, such as the strike on a factory in Tatarstan in April 2024. Consequences and strategic implications. Repeated strikes on sensitive targets within Russia mark a significant shift in the dynamics of the war. Ukraine's ability to penetrate deep into enemy territory highlights both technological advances and the determination to undermine Moscow's resources. As these attacks intensify, a sobering reality is emerging for the Kremlin: the vulnerability of its critical infrastructure and the continued weakening of its ability to sustain the conflict over the long term. Precision strike with strategic symbolism. Ukraine strikes steel with steel. Among the options considered in the aftermath of the attack on the Lipetsk plant is the FP-1 drone, capable of carrying a payload of up to 40 kilograms of explosives, accompanied by 15 kilograms of metal ball bearings. Upon detonation, these balls are propelled with devastating force, causing severe destruction over a wide area. If this model was indeed used, the strike could also be seen as a symbolic message: a battle of steel against steel, executed with lethal efficiency against a key unit in Russia's industrial infrastructure. For now, however, Ukrainian authorities have not officially claimed responsibility for the attack, while the Russian side continues to investigate the drone remnants and works to extinguish the fires caused by the explosion. Target: a giant of Russia's heavy industry. According to the Kyiv Independent, the air raid directly targeted the Novolipetsk steel plant, NLMK, the largest steel facility in Russia, responsible for approximately 20% of the country's total steel output. Specifically, the Lipetsk facility produces around 80% of NLMK Group's total output. This plant is not only a central pillar of the Russian economy, but also a vital asset for oligarch Vladimir Lysin, a figure closely associated with the Kremlin. On the company's official website, NLMK emphasizes that this plant is the core of its international production chain, being directly connected to operations in the European Union and the United States. In 2021, the company controlled nearly the entire domestic market for transformer steel, and was also a leader in cold-rolled and coated steel segments, holding market shares between 19% and 31%. Economic and military impact of the attack. The destruction or severe impairment of such a facility has implications that go beyond the metallurgical industry. The steel produced here is essential in critical sectors, including energy, where it is used to manufacture industrial equipment. Striking this facility raises questions about Russia's ability to keep its energy infrastructure operational and up to date. Moreover, steel is a fundamental resource in arms production, from armor plating and mechanical components to launchers and missiles. At a time when Russia is struggling with shortages in raw materials and sustaining military output, attacks on industrial targets like this one amplify the strategic vulnerabilities of Putin's regime. The Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA, has labeled 2025 as the year of reckoning for Russia, highlighting the systemic crisis facing the country's defense industry. Among the main issues, rapidly rising production costs, a shortage of skilled labor, and deteriorating financial resources. In this context, a reduction in steel production delivers a double blow, both economic and military. The attack on the Lipetsk plant is not just an effective tactical operation, but also a strategic warning. Russia's ability to maintain its war tempo is increasingly fragile. Soviet stockpiles are running out, the collapse of Russia's armament future. Russia's production crisis is further compounded by another critical factor: the depletion of its Soviet-era weapons stockpiles. For years, these reserves served as a buffer for the shortcomings of Russia's modern military industry, but according to CEPA estimates, most of these stockpiles will be exhausted by the end of 2024. Continuous pressure in the Donetsk region and attempts to retake lost territories, including in the Kursk Oblast, have accelerated this depletion process. Artillery, main battle tank, and armored vehicle reserves are at the breaking point. Reserves of artillery, main battle tanks, and armored vehicles are already stretched to the limit, making the loss of an essential steel source like the Novolipetsk plant a potentially catastrophic problem for the Putin regime. As Russia struggles to replace lost equipment, it is also facing a severe labor shortage, with over 400,000 skilled workers and engineers missing since 2022. The immediate consequence? Fewer and weaker Russian weapons in 2025. Even if raw materials remain available, steel quality is expected to decline, and the lack of qualified personnel will directly affect the reliability of military equipment. Drone strikes expose cracks in Russian defense. Steel's economic decline hits the Kremlin's wallet. The steel and iron industry accounts for roughly 5% of Russia's GDP, and export revenues play a key role in funding the war. However, in 2023, these revenues dropped significantly. Russia exported 11 million tons less steel than in 2022, which directly impacted annual revenue from $186 billion in 2022 to $154 billion in 2023. To compensate for falling exports, the Russian government has encouraged domestic consumption, redirecting resources to the construction and mechanical engineering sectors, both vital to logistics infrastructure and military transport capabilities. Still, without stable steel production, critical projects like railway maintenance or the construction of ships and armored vehicles become unsustainable. Massive military losses and growing logistical pressure. Since 2022, Russia has lost over 10,000 tanks and nearly 21,000 armored combat vehicles, according to Western estimates. While the Russian Navy no longer plays a central role in the country's military strategy, rail and ground infrastructure remains essential for troop movements and frontline supply chains. Without steel, these critical structures cannot be maintained or expanded. Listen, the unsanctioned oligarch behind the war machine. Vladimir Lysin, the man behind the NLMK group, occupies a paradoxical position. In March 2022, shortly after the invasion of Ukraine, he was one of the few Russian oligarchs to publicly oppose the war, calling for an end to hostilities and a diplomatic solution. However, an NLMK spokesperson refused to confirm the authenticity of that message, and Lysin has since continued cooperating with the Russian state. To this day, he has not been sanctioned by the European Union or the United States. Only Australia has imposed travel restrictions on him. Despite his official stance of distancing himself from the war, His group has signed at least 18 contracts with companies in Russia's defense industry, according to a 2022 investigation. This impunity has turned him into a symbol of the contradictions in the Western sanctions system, a source of frustration for Ukrainian authorities. Steel target: how Ukraine is hitting the Kremlin's economic network. The drone strike on the Novolipetsk steel plant in the city of Lipetsk can be seen as a carefully calculated move aimed at more than just Russia's industrial infrastructure. In reality, it sends a clear signal to a strategic economic actor, Vladimir Lysin, one of the most influential Russian oligarchs and the owner of the NLMK Group. Given that Lysin has remarkably escaped international sanctions from the EU or the US, Ukraine may have decided to apply direct pressure on his economic interests. The goal of such an attack goes beyond physical damage to the factory. It could lead to a substantial drop in revenues from steel sales to Russia's defense industry, directly impacting the Kremlin's ability to fund and sustain its war effort. Losing a key steel source in the middle of a domestic production crisis not only complicates arms manufacturing, but also weakens Putin's economic position at a time when resources are already scarce. Kyiv's economic strategy: precision strikes at the heart of Russian industry. The attack on the NLMK plant is not an isolated case. It is part of a broader Ukrainian strategy designed to sabotage not only military production chains but also the financial interests of those who support directly or indirectly the Kremlin regime. Successive strikes on critical infrastructure, steel plants, oil refineries, logistics centers have a common goal: to reduce Russia's ability to economically and logistically sustain its war. In this context, it is understandable that Ukraine would adopt a strategy of economic deterrence, specifically targeting oligarchs like Lysin. With vast fortunes and major influence over key economic sectors, these tycoons are vulnerable to a systematic campaign that cuts into their profits. If the economic losses grow large enough, some of them could be motivated to distance themselves from Putin's regime, a long-term strategic objective for Kyiv. A war on multiple fronts: military, economic, and psychological. The impact of these attacks goes far beyond industrial losses. They have the potential to isolate Russia economically, disrupt supply chains, and create fractures within the oligarchic system that supports the state. In an economy already weakened by sanctions, with a shrinking labor force and dwindling Soviet-era weapon reserves, any loss of critical infrastructure represents another step toward the systemic erosion of Russia's war capacity. Strikes on refineries, for instance, affect not only the fuel reserves needed for military vehicles, but also the defense industry's ability to operate at full capacity. In this sense, Ukraine is not only fighting a trench war, but also a prolonged economic war of attrition, where every blow has a multiplied effect on the entire structure supporting Putin's regime. Internal pressure. Will Lysin break? Vladimir Lysin is a special case. Although he was among the few Russian oligarchs who officially opposed the invasion in March 2022, he continued cooperating with the Russian state, and his industrial group signed contracts with companies in the military-industrial complex. The fact that he has not been sanctioned by the West has made him a controversial figure, influential, vulnerable, and, at the same time, a potential leverage point for economic pressure. If attacks on his assets continue and begin to significantly impact NLMK's profits, Lysin may be forced to reevaluate his loyalty to the Kremlin. And if a figure with Lysin's economic weight begins to distance himself publicly, that move could pave the way for other oligarchs who are already quietly questioning the direction in which Russia is heading.